AMS filament waste. We've spoken about it a bit on the channel, but here are some strategies to minimize how much of your filaments going into the purge bin. So there's a lot of multicolor systems on the market now, like the Anycubic Ace, the Creality CFS, or of course, my favorite, the Bamboo AMS. And all these systems have one thing in common. They allow the user to print multiple colors, but only use one nozzle to do it. The biggest downfall of a printer like this, as opposed to something like an IDEX or a tool changer machine, is the waste. There's a lot of it, and by and large, it's totally unavoidable. But with a little bit of strategy, it can be minimized or even used in your favor in some cases. So that's what we're going to cover here. We're going to talk about model orientation. We're going to talk about colorization strategies, batch printing, purge adjustment, prime towers, flushing options, and maybe we can even save a little bit of time and filament. First of all, let's take a second to understand exactly what happens when your machine's performing a color change. In the case of most systems, the old color is retracted and the new one's inserted. From there, the old filament's purged from the tool head by the new filament being inserted, and that ensures there's no cross-contamination between the two materials. The more color changes that have to occur on your model, the more times this procedure happens, the more purges that will happen, and then the more waste and print time there will be as a result. It's important to understand because it's not actually all that difficult to work around. You've just got to think about it a little bit. If you're keeping the mechanics of these color changes in mind, you can be more intentional about your print preparation and reduce your consumption. So the first thing we should cover is model orientation. Now that we know what's happening with our machine when a color change occurs, let's strategize a little bit on how we should orient our models. If we have a lot of features that need to be colored in a specific way, it's helpful to orient the models so those color changes are happening in plane with the layer lines. I'll talk about it more in a second, but in the case of these whistles that I sell on my Etsy shop, it's best to print in this orientation, laying down. Typically, when I have letters on something, I like to print so the letters are on the side of the model instead of on the top face of the model. You get a lot better, more crisp line on your letters. But if I still needed to color those letters and they were on the side of the model, well, that's going to induce a color change every single layer. When I lay the whistle down flat like this, the color change happens one time and the personalization is still highlighted. Now, tying into the considerations with orientation, another way to keep your waste and print times low is to colorize strategically. In the case of these Backhoes that I printed out for my kid, I wanted to apply a little bit of color to spice it up a little bit. Not that my kid really cares, he just wants a Backhoe all the time. So I printed this model in one color, but I wanted to print it again and colorize it a little bit more. I chose to color the wheels and some other features. Now, this took quite a long time and it generated so much waste even though the model was tiny. So when it came to do a giant one, I had to change the strategy just a little bit. I decided to use the fill tool and select individual faces of the model instead of entire features. Now the faces that I chose were in plane of the layer lines. That meant I could get a lot of colorization knocked out inside of 2 or 3 layers in some cases. But in the case of coloring entire features, like talking about that first Backhoe that I printed colorized, those wheels made a color change happen every single layer. So by selectively coloring faces that are in plane of the layer lines like this, you kind of get the best of both worlds. The model gets a little bit of color, the filament changes are reduced by quite a bit. So by extension, the amount of waste and print times come down quite a bit. Now the same strategy can be applied sort of using full features as well as just faces too. Let's say the design requirements of this Backhoe demand that the full bucket be colored one color, different than the rest of the model. That's a concession that we have to make. It's a design requirement. There's nothing we can do about that volume of waste that's already going to be generated. But from there, we can at least make the most of it. By that I mean, if those layers are already requiring there be a color change, I can select other entire features that are in plane with those color changes and have those colorized too. By adding it in layers that are already having a color change, I'm not adding any time or waste to the model because the color changes were already occurring. I'm just taking advantage and piggybacking off of that fact. No additional waste, very little additional print time. Now, the other single most impactful thing is less of a reduction in consumption and more of a value measure. Now, this strategy makes use of printing batches of models instead of single models with multiple colors. We've spoken about batch printing at length, and I can link a video to that, but this is the idea. If you have your model, your single model, colorized, the amount of color changes that need to occur for that model to be printed, that's a set number. Now, if you double or triple or quintuple the amount of models on that build plate, the number of color changes that need to occur to print it, still the same. The tool head still needs to switch the colors and purge the filament in between each color change, whether you've got 1 model or 20 models. The only thing you're really changing is how much filament is used per layer because there's more or fewer models. But by increasing the amount of filament used per layer, the proportion of filament that's used for waste and used for the target models has changed greatly. So when we look at me printing a batch of these nachos, we can see how much filament it's going to take to do 1 nacho and how much time it's going to take to do that 1 model. Now when we bump it up to 4 models, you can see just how big of a difference it has, both in the amount of consumption that we have and the print time. And again, when we fill the plate completely and we check the numbers, sure, you've got an increase in consumption and there is an increase in print time, but the amount of waste never changes. The number of color changes that are occurring isn't changing. And that's something that takes quite a bit of time when we're considering the print time of a multicolor model. So this is by far the best way to add value to your multicolor prints, without a doubt. So even though this doesn't eliminate waste, it does give you a lot more in return for that waste. So we've spoken about purge volumes in the past, and when used to an extreme, it's kind of a viable option. You can check out our other video here if you want to see more on that. But the idea here is you adjust your purge volumes to minimize the amount of waste happening during those color changes. In fact, this is the first thing you should do when using one of these multicolor systems, is check what are your purge volumes for color changes. If they aren't already set up like this, you should have it auto-calculate based on the colors that's changing. When changing from a darker color to a lighter color, the amount of purge volume that's required to make a clean change happen is going to be quite a bit. And vice versa is true when you're changing from a lighter color to a darker color. You don't need nearly as much volume to create that color change. In the video I was talking about, we printed one of those giant pass-through cones, and we effectively turned the purge multiplier down to 0. That meant the machine didn't purge any material during color changes. So the result was going to be a little bit of a color bleed, which is kind of what I was going for. I was going for a bit of a neat, controlled gradient kind of effect, which sort of happened towards the top of the model. The smaller cross-sectional area of the layer meant that the color change was being distributed across more of the layer, a larger percentage of the layer. Unfortunately, I used the flush to infill option as well, so a lot of the color change for most of the model was happening inside the model. It would have been cool if I could have had that gradient all occurring on the outside of the model, but nonetheless, the idea was pretty cool to explore. More importantly, the amount of purge for this entire model was this. Unreal. Now another note that this reminds me of is the prime tower modifications. Now this is another way you can reduce waste, but it tends to come at a cost. Now on this model I tried to take out some of the waste by removing some of the volume from the prime tower. If you've got a large model that has color changes occurring throughout the entire height of the print, the prime tower is going to be generated for that entire height as well. And that whole prime tower, that's waste. So minimizing that, that's something that we can do. But it doesn't come without its own risks. In this case, the issue that it can cause is super present on this model. The prime tower serves a handful of purposes, but one of it is prepping the nozzle to print on the target model. So in a lot of cases, this prime tower can act as a sacrificial model. So when you have filament buildup on the nozzle, often it'll dislodge on the prime tower, thus prepping the nozzle for printing on the object. So during color changes, if you have any residual filament that's stuck to that nozzle, or any residual filament, in theory, that's going to be caught on this prime tower. That's what we mean by prepping the nozzle. So in the case of this print, I feel like it wasn't quite enough. There wasn't quite enough time spent for any of that loose filament to actually get stuck in the prime tower. There were a lot of random strings caught all over my model here, and there's a lot of pock marks left as a result. And even though this isn't something that's terribly uncommon, there would have been far fewer of them if the prime tower was the right volume to catch all that stuff. So it's something to consider, but it could be a waste savings. The next strategy I want to cover is the flush to model strategy. This makes use of one of your models being a sacrificial one that allows you to flush all the filament into it instead of all into the waste. So at least if you're printing a whole plate of models, you can get another model out of it instead of it just being wasted filament. And if you're really trying to cut down, you can take out the purge tower completely and use your sacrificial flushed model as the purge tower of sorts. So the idea of this is similar to batch printing. The flush is a necessary evil, so how can we put it to use? So depending on what you're printing, this may be economical as opposed to the regular purge. That said, there are cases where using this method could lead to more consumption, so you'll have to check what you're printing. It's going to vary from model to model. I hadn't messed with this at all until I was preparing for this video. I've got to say, as a father of a toddler, this is an excellent way to capture some of your waste material that otherwise would have ended up in a box, and then they recycle. Got plastic toys all over the house, but for whatever reason, the boy wants whatever's on the build plate. To activate this feature, just right-click on whatever model you want to sacrifice and select the Flush to Model option. From there, you could set your purge multiplier to 0 and just let this model take care of the transition completely. This doesn't result in anything that looks pretty, but at least you're getting something out of it. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all method for reducing waste, but I feel like at the very least, paying attention to your flush volumes is a huge one. Beyond that, your colorization strategy and batch printing can be huge things to help you maximize the amount of print you're getting for the waste that's being used. Now, these multicolor systems, they're not the most efficient, and they're not without their own shortcomings, but it's not that difficult to live with them, and the more you understand about it, the better you can plan for those. Bye.